You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford, Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mock,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is...
Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Michelle Adams on the show with me today. She has a phenomenal new book. It's called Little Wishes, and this is a book that you must have on your bookshelf for going into this fall. Today is release day, November 17th, and I'm excited to feature the book on the release day of the book on the show today. Welcome to the show, Michelle.
Thanks so much for having me here.
I'm excited to have you. Michelle, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Okay, that's a really easy one for me to answer because it's really, really clear. As a child, we used to have these sort of family get-togethers with sort of close family friends. And one of our family friends was a really avid reader, and he had a fantastic bookshelf covered with all sorts of books and various stories. And I was probably 8 or 9 years old, and I pulled out a novel that to me just looked really, really interesting. On the front cover, there was this moody, moonlit scene of a bed. There were I think there might have even been dogs on it. There was definitely some sort of blood spill on the floor. And I had no idea what it was, but it was Gerald's Game. And I turned the book over, and there was this black and white picture of Stephen King on the back. And I asked if I could borrow it, at which point there was this sort of conversation between the adults in the room, whether I should or I shouldn't be allowed to read a Stephen King book at the age of 9. But also the story between them was just, I couldn't really believe it, because as a child, you look at books as just, well, they're storybooks. But there was this discussion between the adults about, you know, what kind of person did you have to be to write the kinds of stories that Stephen King wrote? And I just looked at the picture on the back of the book and thought, you're so clever. Like, how did you convince these people that you're all, that there's something wrong with you? Like, all you do is write stories. And I remember thinking, if that's what a writer can do, that's what I want to be.
I love that. So, you know, for a lot of people, there's this moment where there's sort of a realization that there's a real person behind these books. You know, for some reason, when we're very young, we just think that books are magical or ethereal, and they just kind of show up out of the mist somewhere. But like when you flipped over that book and saw the picture of Stephen King, you know that there's a person. This is a story that he made up and that he told. Yes. Was it sort of a realization for you like that? Like, you know, one, I'm very intrigued by the cover and the description, but there's a person behind this. Was that a kind of an awakening moment for you?
It was, I think. I remember that before that, I had been really interested in books. I was a big fan of Roald Dahl as a younger child, and I used to collect his books. And I was excited about things like book club at school. We used to have this scheme where you could collect stamps every week, and then you'd have enough stamps and you would buy the book. And I was really keen on things like this. So I had a real passion for books, but I didn't really have a face behind the stories. But I think what excited me the most was the reaction of other people, because it was the first adult book that I'd ever sort of picked up. And I think to see the reaction of everybody else, that it could spark such passion, because my mum was very, no, you can't read something like that. And then somebody else would say, well, just let her read it, it'll be fine. And I think just to see that the fact that a person who wrote it could create that discussion amongst a group of people so far away who hadn't even read the book was just, that was the magical bit about it. And Stephen King in the 80s, you know, he looked very cool on his book. You know?
Oh yes, lots of drama, lots of drama,
black and white, big glasses.
So Michelle, this desire is born out of that. and moments between that moment and where you are now, the path to becoming a writer and then a published writer is circuitous at best for a lot of people.
Yes.
Very, very few people have this moment of realization and then just immediately pour everything they have into this quest to get published.
Yeah.
Most of us have, meandering sort of journeys between raising families and working for a living and all that. What happened with you along the way?
Well, my story is exactly as you describe it. It's meandering and in no way linear. I developed this desire that I would like to be a writer. I went to a school that was very keen on academic success, in the sense you leave school and you go straight to university. And with that sort of with that mentality instilled in me, I didn't want to be a journalist or something like that. The only love I had in the world of literature was that I wanted to be a writer. But I remember raising it as a sort of idea, and you got that very stock response of, well, that's a lovely idea, but what are you going to do for a real job? And so I happened to be quite good at biology, and so I ended up studying science and becoming a clinical physiologist in the health system in the UK when I used to live in the UK. But the desire to write a book had never left me. And I had always had these sort of slightly plagiarized ideas when I was 18 and 19 that were based on things like Ian Banks and Stephen King, which I never did anything with. And I remember talking to my closest friend on a very wet New Year's Eve when I was 21 or 22, and here I'm going to write my book. And she said, oh, that's great. What a lovely idea. And it then took me another 6 years. But I did get to that point where I sort of decided, I've been talking about this for such a long time, that the only thing that's in my way of doing this is myself, and I keep putting it off. And that was the moment when I sat down and wrote my first book, that I knew that if I was ever going to be a writer, then I had to do something called writing.
So your first two books that you published are psychological thrillers,
Yes.
which is a little bit of a departure from your new book, Little Wishes, that we're talking
Yes.
about today. But what was it about psychological thrillers that intrigued you, or maybe that still intrigues you, I'm sure? But does it harken back to that experience with Stephen King? What was it that kind of built this love of that genre in you?
I think that genre has always been something I've been drawn to in both literature and screen. I love psychological thriller movies just as much. And when I came to sit down to write my first book, which was not the first book that was published, I wrote 6 books before I wrote a book that was picked up by an agent and a publisher.
Of course you did.
Of course. But they were all pretty much sort of thrillers, dystopian thrillers. And I think I was just drawn to the sort of darker stories. It was what I was consuming myself. I loved thrillers. I loved sci-fi. And so that was naturally what I knew. And so when it came to writing my first efforts, so to speak, it was just very natural that's what I would be drawn to.
As a writer who wrote several novels that were not published, and then you land on the idea of that becomes the first book that becomes published. Can you look and see a difference in the book that was published as opposed to the 6 previous? Like, is there a line of demarcation for you? Is there, was there something in particular that you were able to accomplish then that you look back and say, okay, now I know this is why I wasn't ready yet. I hadn't figured out how to do X, or, is there a line in your mind between what did get published and what did not?
Yes, I think so. I wrote my first book, and I think I sort of reached the the 75 to 80,000 word mark and did a celebratory cheer and thought, yes, I've done it. And I had no idea what it meant to edit, or I thought editing was going through and having a look at whether you made any typing errors or something like that. So I had no idea what it was to edit, which is a huge step, I think, in becoming a writer that can sell a book. And along with that, I think there was just a very natural progression of improvement. And whether that was in part the fact that I did learn to go back and work on my work and to improve it, or whether it was just, I think I needed to write that many words before I came to the story that I really needed to tell. And one thing that I did, which I would support any writer doing, is when I submitted my first ever book to an agent and didn't get picked up with representation, I decided that I was going to self-publish it via Amazon. And that for me was a really pivotal moment, because what I really wanted to do was to see my book in front of readers. And I have a fairly thick skin for people's critique. And so using Amazon as a way to, one, get my work in front of people and get their feedback was a really sort of inspiring thing. People were telling me that they'd enjoyed the story, and that was something that I think, it feels great as a writer to have somebody read your first books and then say, oh, that was lovely, are you going to write another one? So it's really inspiring to keep you going, what is quite a sort of long-winded hobby. But also using the reviews that I was getting on Amazon in those first early books, I could look for common patterns. I would see where I was going wrong. People would say it was too much fiction or it was too bleak. And so these sorts of patterns enabled me to really hone the nature of the writing that I was producing. I was still going to publish self-publishing via that route when I wrote the book that got published by a publishing house. And it was a very last-minute decision to just think, okay, well, I'll just give it a shot here with an agent. So it was a lucky decision.
I love that idea of using Amazon and the fantastic platform that they provide to writers and publishers now, because it really is an option, for a lot of people. And but using that as a way to connect with readers and then to hone your craft, because you can get nearly immediate feedback on that. And, as opposed to sort of this tribalism that has cropped up in publishing with the us versus them and, kind of the middle finger to the other side, when a writer really should use all of the tools in his or her tool set to become a better writer. And I think that's a fantastic way to use that.
I think the attitude has changed a lot now. I think when I first started publishing in via Amazon, I think it must have been 2012 when I released my first book on that platform. And I do think at the time there was very much a mentality of, well, I'm a self-publisher, so I'm not part of the traditional publishing world. And then traditional publishers sort of looked down on what self-publishing was. Sure. And there was still that sort of mentality that self-publishing is a vanity press, and that if you want to be a real writer, you have to find an agent and a publisher. But I don't think that that's the same anymore, because I think what people have realized is that there is a huge amount of quality in the self-publishing world. Yeah. And I didn't go from being a bad writer to a good writer because I wrote one book that got published. It was a natural progression. And, I wrote a lot of stories that people had a lot of good things to say about. And I didn't have an agent. I think having an agent and a publisher is a great sort of stamp of approval, but I don't think it's necessary any longer. And it shouldn't be a barrier to a writer working and having their books in front of the readers.
A hitman with a conscience. Ian Bragg is paid to kill people. Only bad people, and not many, but for a great deal of money. Case the target. Make the hit. Move on. Until he meets the woman with sparkling green eyes who changes everything. A few pre-readers had this to say about Ian Bragg. Mark Dawson, million-selling thriller author, says a rip-roaring ride from start to breathless finish. Craig Martell hit a home run with The Operator. The taut, lean prose and lightning-fast pace make this a page-turner without sacrificing an ounce of story or depth. You'll find yourself rooting for the hitman main character as he faces the toughest decision of his career. The Operator is the start of a new thriller series I expect to see burning up bestseller lists for years to come, says A.C. Fuller, author of The Crime Beat and Alex Vane media thrillers. Suave, romantic, and lethal, Ian Bragg is everything you want in a highly paid assassin. Can't wait to ride this train, says James Blatch, Self-Publishing Formula. It's been a long time since I fell this hard in love with a book, a very long time. Author of Women of Wine County romantic suspense Terry Wells Brown says. Grab this book from Craig Martell, The Operator. Both Barrels Publishing is the brainchild of successful indie author James P. Sumner. He has self-published over 15 titles in the last 5 years and has over 800,000 downloads so far in his career, meaning he has a wealth of knowledge and experience to share with the indie publishing community. Knowing the struggles of the modern-day indie author as well as he does, he wanted to create a platform that would allow writers of any level to learn the ropes, navigate the pitfalls, and produce a professional novel without wasting time or money in the process. Both Barrels Publishing is the perfect one-stop shop for any indie author, combining James's expertise with his own team of editors and designers so you can help your novel realize its full potential and learn how to publish yourself. The purpose of Both Barrels Publishing is to help indie authors get their novels ready for publication without all the stress, hassle, and unnecessary expense. We want to make your lives easier, which is why we're giving you access to a top-notch team to publish your novels, along with a generous discount on their services. You can also work one-on-one with James to learn the intricacies of self-publishing. No hidden cost, no false promises. We simply want you to publish the best version of your novel. BothBarrelsPublishing.com.
So those first two books were in the psychological thriller genre, and Little Wishes is a little different. What was it about this book that was different from you? And did you know from the very beginning that this would be a different sort of story that you would tell?
I did. And the reason for that is because I was inspired to write this book for a very different reason. My psychological thrillers were the kinds of stories I love to write, and kind of stories I love to read. But Little Wishes was inspired by something that we sort of went through as a family. I'm not giving anything away to say that in Little Wishes, there's a character who's very ill with cancer. And my father was diagnosed with the same disease that Tom, the character, has in the book. And it was a very, very quick diagnosis and a very quick disease progression. And we lost him sort of 8 weeks after he was first diagnosed. But
I'm so sorry.
Thank you. It's 4 years ago now. But it was very hard at the time, as you know, millions of families know. What I experienced as his daughter is no different to so many people's experiences, sadly, of their family. And because I was living in Cyprus at the time, I still am living in Cyprus, but it was very difficult to sort of manage being there for him and trying to support him. And so I was flying back and forth. And on the final time that I was going to the UK, it was a very rushed flight. I had to get the sort of last flight that I could, which was Cyprus to England via Lithuania with an 8-hour layover. And so I sat in the airport alone, because we have a family. We couldn't all just ship up. I just had to go on my own. And I sat there in the airport bar with my computer and nobody around. It was the most bizarre experience. And I thought, what am I going to do for 8 hours? And the only thing I know how to do in order to make sense of the things that I'm sort of aware of in the world is to write. But I found when I got my computer out that it wasn't about the sort of bleakness of him having cancer that I wanted to necessarily write about, but instead it was the relationship that I'd witnessed between him and his partner. She had just literally, as soon as he was diagnosed, just cared for him so much and stood next to him every step of the way. I don't think she left his side for hardly any time at all. And when I was having to go back to Cyprus to sort of be with my family, I knew that he was just with her, which was such a sort of comfort to know that she was there. And what I remember taking from it is, one, that, there were so many people around us in the hospital who were there offering a sort of positive role in what we were going through. But it was what they shared in those last 8 weeks of his life that really inspired me to write this, because it was the first time I think I'd ever seen somebody offer their love to somebody when there was just literally no hope of getting anything out of it. It was just the most selfless, kind period that I witnessed between them, and it was really, as sad as it was also something really positive to take from it, that that people could love when there was no hope for something at the end of it.
So out of this very personal experience that you were going through, as a lot of storytellers do, and I love the way that you kind of summed that up, that there was one thing that you knew that you could do to help process these feelings, and that's to tell a story about it. Where did these characters of Elizabeth and Tom come from? Because they have such a fascinating relationship that we discover on the pages. How did you come up with them and their interesting situation?
Well, it was very easy to sort of develop Tom. He's not based on my father, really, but there are elements of my dad's life that sort of run through him as a character, and I suppose they share some characteristics. So he was quite easy. But then I wanted to create the person that he falls in love with. And we're talking about 1968 in a small village by the coast in England, in a county called Cornwall. And I tried to put myself in the shoes of what would take two people who were in love at sort of 18 years old at that period in our world, and what could keep them apart. And one of the things that I realized would be very difficult for them was their different social situation. If say he was from a sort of family from the wrong side of the tracks, and she was from quite a good family who had big expectations of what she would do and achieve in her life. And I thought it would be really interesting to bring two people like that together and then see how the social situation around them pulled them apart. And so then I was asking myself, what kind of woman would that be? What kind of things would she experience? Who would her family members be? So it was a lot of fun to create them.
Well, and we've seen lots of variations on this kind of story where, you have the two people that were never meant to be together, but they fall in love. And then a lot of times there's a tragic ending, but the way these characters, their relationship kind of, even though they're not together, they stay connected over distance and time. What was the idea? Where did that come from to keep these people connected yet at arm's length?
I suppose that's twofold, really. In the one instance, it was directly influenced by my dad and his partner, because they had never quite sort of formalized their relationship. They'd kept their sort of independent lives, and it was only at this sort of time of diagnosis when they both sort of looked at each other and said, "Oh my God, like we've wasted so much time." So it was definitely that kind of element that I wanted to bring in, that a sort of sense of time has gone by and we've missed out. But also, I wanted to think about the fact that there are people that do love people from afar, and they want to be together, but things get in the way. And the truth is that lots of people aren't brave enough to take the right steps, or to be with the person that they want to be, or that they want to be with, or they sort of bow to social pressures. And I thought that's what these people would have been like from the 60s. And so even though they were in love, the fact that they were kept apart by some of their own choices and some of the circumstances that presented themselves, I thought it would be really interesting to see what they would be like if they had continued to love each other but hadn't actually been a big part of each other's lives.
So from this time in the airport bar during a layover, where you used this as a way to help you process what you were feeling and what you were going through, when did you know that this was going to be a story that would be bigger than you, that you would share?
Well, it was absolutely the wrong timing, because I had recently signed a contract for the 2 psychological thrillers, and they hadn't even been published yet. So I was in London for the Christmas party of my agent, and we were sharing a taxi from her office to go and have a meeting with my editor before the party. And I said to her, by the way, I've got this idea for a love story. And I suppose a lot of agents would have just turned around and said, hang on a minute, we've got 2 psychological thrillers to finish and publish. Just, you're going to have to put that on the back burner. But she was completely enthusiastic about it. I have a brilliant agent. She's so supportive. And so she said, that sounds great. I told her the story. And she said, let's just focus on getting this first book published. And then when you've got a break in your program, let's write it. And that's 4 years ago now. That will be 4 years ago this coming Christmas. So it hasn't been a fast process, but I finished writing the next psychological thriller and then put the finished ideas down. I had that first chapter. I think I've written 2 or 3 chapters after that, and then very slowly adapted it. And I was out of contract for the psychological thrillers, and so it was just a really great time to focus on this book.
We talked a little bit earlier about the differences in publishing and how self-publishing is now a viable opportunity for a lot of writers. And I love your story of using that as a way to build an audience and to get feedback from readers, and all that's wonderful. But we talk a lot about authors building their author brand and
yes.
becoming known for a certain genre or writing a certain style of books, because we want readers to say, I want to pick up a Michelle Adams book, not necessarily a specific title, but they build trust in you so that they want to buy all of your books. Psychological thrillers are very different from Little Wishes. How do you feel about writing 2 very different genres, and what are your expectations about your readers, and will they follow you, and is that something that you even think about?
It is something that I think about. It's something I thought a lot more before I got to this stage. I remember when I wanted to write Little Wishes, and thinking, I'm not sure about crossing over to another genre. I think historically it wasn't seen as a very easy thing to do. And a name, let's take a famous person that we've already mentioned, like Stephen King. We associate that name with this style of book. But I think that the attitudes towards that have definitely changed. And that's definitely my experience of what I've received from my agent and the publishers that are publishing Little Wishes, is that there isn't quite such a problem there anymore. There was some talk about whether I would publish this under a different name, but ultimately I think what you mentioned about authors building a brand, I think most publishers want to sort of capitalize on that. And as long as there isn't a direct competition, say I was releasing a thriller at the same time as releasing Little Wishes, via two different publishers, I think that would be quite difficult. But because I'm not currently releasing a thriller, I don't think that there's the competition in the market. And I think most people now understand that lots of writers are able to write in different genres. And I think there are even a lot of writers now that we know. Claire McIntosh, for example, she's very famous for her thrillers and has released a non-thriller this year, which has done very well. So I think people are more amenable to it. And I'm not, as a writer, I'm not concerned. I think it's very clear which books are thrillers and which books are not. And I think most readers like to read across different genres. And if they enjoy one book, they might try another book, and that opens them up to a different world that's being created by the writer. So I think it's a great thing.
Well, I think it's high time for writers to be let off the hook, so to speak, because you're absolutely right that readers, I read all over the place, every genre, and why can't writers do the same? Let's open ourselves up, and I think we'll get more fantastic stories that way.
I think so.
Yeah. Michelle, you also have a podcast, the Beyond Words podcast, and I love your concept that you have there. How has getting to talk to other writers and exploring other people's stories, what has that done for you and your creative process?
It's been a lot of fun, actually. It was something that I was thinking about for a while, and I'd wanted to do so. And then we all had this year a very different working environment, and I think that sort of shuffling up of the status quo made me say, well, okay, well, let's just see if we can make this happen. And I was very unaware of how that would be received, and I contacted a few of the first writers that I wanted to feature, and I was really pleased by their positivity and receptiveness to the idea. And that really bolstered me to say, okay, maybe there's a call for this. And I've had a lot of positive comments of people saying that they've been enjoying it, which has been great. And for me as a writer, it's just really nice to get to chat to other writers. But also, I think every writer really is a reader. And that's really the standpoint that I come to the podcast as, is someone that's picked up a book and loved it, and then had the opportunity to sit down with the writer who wrote it and ask the questions that I had as a reader. So it's been a lot of fun to sort of blend those two worlds as being a reader and a writer.
Absolutely. And it's called the Beyond Words podcast. I know there's a link at your website, but I would highly recommend everyone go subscribe to that.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. The new book is called Little Wishes, and it's on sale everywhere today in Kindle edition and hardcover and audiobook. Any way that you like to consume books, you can find it. We'll put links to it in the show notes to make it easy for people to find. Michelle, if people are just discovering you and want to dig into all the amazing stuff that you do, where can they find you online?
The place that I'm most active is Instagram, and I am M. Adams Writer. I'm also on Twitter and Facebook, and I have a website which is michelleadams.co.uk.
Excellent. We'll put links to all those in the show notes as well. Michelle, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today. We're going to send everyone to pick up their copy of Little Wishes and to connect with you online. Thank you for taking time to come on the show.
Thanks so much for having me here. It's been a total pleasure.
On an isolated human planet called Phoenix, outside the Galactic Gate Network, a royal empire teeters on the brink of revolution. The new emperor is weak, the old guard seeks power, and a hidden slave cabal manipulates the great and small houses alike. None of this concerns Simeon Brezhnev, newly appointed steward to one of the most powerful heiresses on the planet. Happy to let the royals play their age-old game of catch the crown, Simeon is more concerned with balancing his mistress's books than worrying about affairs of state. But when Simeon discovers evidence of sedition at the highest levels of government buried deep within her finances, he realizes her great peril. Though a slave, he finds himself trapped in political intrigue, desperate to protect his mistress from the royals who would see her dead and the slave rebels who would make her their pawn. Agonized by the choice of turning her over to the authorities or protecting her secrets, Simeon decides to keep faith with his sovereign over his larger duty, thus flinging himself into a world of power, plot, and assassination. If he fails, they both die, and with them the chance at freedom for Simeon's enslaved race. Set in the Salvage title universe, Salvage Mind is the first of 3 novels in a new breakout series. Available in ebook format and paperback, grab your copy today. Salvage Mind by David Allen Jones.